I am incredibly proud, Gavin, to have you on the Geospatial Index. You're head of engineering at Fathom, a flood model vendor as part of Swiss Re, which is one of the world's largest global reinsurance firms. So welcome.
Thank you, Wilfred, and great to be with you.
So I understand you're joining us from Bristol today in the UK. I've got a minor connection to that city myself, having worked at Arup there a couple of years ago. So yeah, glad to have someone from the UK again.
Yeah, well, Bristol's a great city. The business started over 10 years ago as a spin out from Bristol University, and our office is literally right by the uni, so we're very close to our roots. You mentioned Arup, they're one of our partners on the engineering side, and we do quite a lot of work with them.
Okay, there you go. Excellent. So then let's get straight into things. What is the elevator pitch for Fathom?
So we build computational flood maps for climate change at a global scale. So we take open source data, we put that through an automated modeling framework, and we develop flood maps showing the issue around different types of flooding, whether that's river flooding, flash flooding, or coastal flooding, at anywhere around the world, both today and also under future climate scenarios, all the way out to 2100. And that modelling is really underpinned by a very robust scientific background. As I mentioned earlier, we came out of Bristol University. The two founders were doing their PhDs in flood research and felt that actually by the application of the science they were developing, they could get a much better understanding of flood risk, particularly in data poor areas where outside of, let's say, the UK and the US, where data was very difficult to get hold of, and it's really applying a lot of that science to get a much better understanding of the impact of flood risk where that data just simply doesn't exist. So we produce flood maps that people use in GIS platforms and a whole range of other platforms. Because we need to understand where downhill is, because obviously we need to understand the flow of water across the Earth's surface. We develop, build and license terrain data sets. We've got to build our own global terrain data set. And then we have developed things like risk scores for people to really get a very quick understanding of flood risk across portfolios for particularly financial services. And then we've developed through the work we're doing with the insurance sector, our CAT models or stochastic models to really take flooding from risk and hazard into understanding and calculating losses due to flooding. So we have quite a wide range of data, but it's all underpinned by a very robust science. We're very transparent about how we build our models. We're very much at the other end of the scale from organizations that are very black box. Everything we do is underpinned by research. We have a large research team here at Fathom, and we probably publish more papers than some research teams in some universities. So we publish all our papers around the methodologies we apply, but it's not just the methodologies, but importantly, it's the validation. How does our data compare to other data sets that are out there, whether that be the Environment Agency here in England, or it could be FEMA in the US. So we make that data available, all those papers available on our website, and we really encourage our end users to dive into those to understand, the science that's being applied, how it's derived, and really getting confidence from that to apply our data in a whole range of different applications.
Wow. Okay. So there's a lot of different directions I can go in from there. But one, I really appreciate how you make your research public, and it's almost like there's a continuous dialogue with academics in your field. To me, that makes it seem like you'd be a preferable employer because there's the feeling that an academic could continue with their work as well as being in a consulting environment.
Absolutely, yeah, and we bring in a lot of academics, both from Bristol and from other institutions across the world, to work for us. And it's not just full time; we do partner on various research projects, we find it really stimulating, and it helps us move forward and grow and challenges what we do. So, it's taken as a given for sort of the DNA for Fathom, really.
Yep. Okay. All right. So the next question is what niche you dominate. I'm going to hazard a guess that it's something to do with flood mapping, but maybe you've got a more technical way to define that niche.
Yeah, flooding is ubiquitous. It impacts communities all over the world. Our data is applicable to a whole range of different applications. We originally started in the insurance sector when we sort of 10 years ago, and that is really one of our core markets, and that has grown significantly. But on the back of that, we've also our data is used in capital markets for really the management of financial assets, and we've also opened up the engineering sector, which is very much around the built environment and infrastructure, and looking at how flood risk and climate change is impacting the built environment and infrastructure at a global scale, but also at a very local scale. So that's built environment piece, that's working with large engineering consultancies. We talked about Arup and Mott MacDonald and others that all use our data for a whole range of really interesting engineering projects in the UK and globally. We also work with a number of players in the public sector. So the Canadian government license our data for the whole of the country because they're looking to develop an insurance program for the whole country, and similar to what they have in the US, but also to raise the awareness of flood risk and the impact of climate change to the Canadian citizens. They've had been impacted very badly, particularly recently, by some very bad flood events, and they now realise that they need to raise the awareness to ensure that they kind of future-proof the country for both individuals, citizens, communities, and the infrastructure. So our data is used there. And then we also do a lot of work in the NGO market. So our data is licensed by World Bank, and also we work with people like Asian Development Bank, looking at the application of our data for emerging economies to make them more resilient to flooding both today and under future climate scenarios.
This equity aspect came up for me, I think, in one of your LinkedIn posts, where I got the impression that you're almost one of the only ones who offer flood intelligence, if you like, for the less fortunate parts of the world, or some countries that just don't have the resources to, because there's a lot of compute even involved in doing flood modeling. So I really appreciated the positive impact that you're having for some parts of the world that are less well served by these types of analytics.
Yeah, thank you. And that is really one of the reasons for the business set up, to try and apply the science to provide a much better understanding of flood risk in those areas that traditionally have been, barren for this type of data. And through the World Bank, we've actually licensed our data for 16 countries. And we see that as a really good step forward.
Okay, that's great. So I guess in your survey of the different customers, you talked about the architecture, engineering, construction industry, or engineering firms that are tasked with building things. You talked about insurance, and that's how you got your start. Finance, or I guess equities analysts trying to size up the risk to portfolio values in response to natural catastrophe events. And you also talked about, I guess, the NGO space. So I don't want to force you to condense things unnecessarily, but is there an ideal customer that Fathom has, and how do you make sure that you're always working backwards from their needs?
Our ideal customer is really someone that is intellectually curious, someone that really wants to understand our science and methodologies to produce the data sets that we use. So someone that really wants to understand that science, but also values it and values the investment in the data to help them understand what the data is telling them, but also importantly, things like uncertainties in the modeling and how that can be used and applied in their day-to-day projects. So our data is used across a wide range of markets, as you alluded to. And I think really getting into the detail and how our data can make a difference across those markets, whether that's efficiencies, but importantly, a much better understanding of the impact of flooding today, but also in the future climate scenarios, is really somewhere that would, I would say, are ideal customers.
It makes me wonder if there's an individual or a profession that sits within these larger organizations that's tasked with judging risk, and it's that team or individual that you're selling to. I'm talking about
Yeah,
actuarial type.
I think they're within the specific markets. On the insurance, it's very much actuarial, but also underwriting. People want to understand the risks of pricing, setting the rates, but also for the cap modeling to look at the risk across large portfolios that insurers are covering. On the financial market, again, it's probably actuarial, but also looking at things like long-term investments, whether that's mortgage portfolios, and looking at that longer term risk. And on the engineering side, again, it could be a wide range of applications.
I think we've got enough in terms of response for your ideal customer. But what I'm also interested to hear is if Fathom has a structured approach to identifying user needs and working backward from them.
One of the things we've really got to be conscious around is our data, and how people really apply our data to the types of issues and problems they're looking to solve. And it's important that our data is used in an appropriate manner. So we always talk to end customers to understand how they're applying our data, what they're looking, the issues they're looking to answer, but also the answers they're looking to draw out from that data to ensure that our data is being used appropriately. Because we develop broad scale, consistent view of flooding at a continental scale, but also at a reasonably local scale, it's good at sort of the early stages of projects. But if people are looking at very detailed flood modeling for particular river stretches or certain defences, our data is not appropriate for that. However, by using our data, it really fast tracks and make things more efficient for people to understand where those problems areas lie. And it's not just sort of the scale and applicability, it's also things around uncertainties to ensure that our clients understand the uncertainties in the models. There is uncertainty in everything we do, and we need to provide better guidance, or sorry, we provide guidance on that uncertainty to ensure that that's taken into consideration in the decisions they're making.
Okay. All right. So taking into account all of these things as a measure, I guess, of how successful Fathom is and how well you have met those needs, how fast and sticky is growth?
Yeah, we been a small business. There were six of us when I joined, and growth was well, obviously quite difficult when we were small. But now we've got we've really grown, particularly in the insurance sector. We've got a good pedigree with our clients. In fact, a lot of the clients that joined us those many years ago are still with us now, and I think that's a great indictment that they value our data. But also, I think the really interesting thing is as our data sets have evolved and improved during time, that they're actually adopting them, they're getting more out of our data, and they're coming with us on that journey. So I think it's really important that is a key element around our clients coming with us on that journey, because our data sets are never static. We're always applying more research. We're trying to find better input data sets. So we're constantly evolving that data, and I think that's what keeps us ahead of the market, and that's what clients really like, is that scientific rigor, but also the fact that we're applying that in developing our data sets under that sort of continuous development. And for us on the growth side, there is significant growth opportunities across all those three: insurance, capital markets, and on the engineering side. We're doing a lot of work on the engineering side in the US, and starting to do more work in Southeast Asia and Australia and New Zealand. But really, we're only scratching the surface there, I think, because flooding is ubiquitous. Everywhere is going to need to understand the impact of flooding, both today, but also as climate change becomes more prevalent. It's ensuring that communities and governments and countries are becoming more resilient to that. So our data can really be one of those elements that underpins that understanding.
Yeah, needless to say, another measure of growth is the fact that a dominant company in a target market of yours bought Fathom. So that's quite an endorsement in terms of growth.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, and which is good for us, and also good for our clients.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get into a bit of the technical details of what you actually offer. So please, could you explain the three stacks, method, component, and risk that you maintain, and recent access developments such as API?
Yeah, okay. So the data stack really around the methods is the application of our science. How do we take the science and apply it meaningfully to derive outputs? The component stack is really the base data sets. It's effectively the building blocks of the data that we use to derive our data sets. And that could be terrain data, river network data, understanding elements of extreme river flows, extreme rainfall, and of course, extreme sea levels with things like sea level rise. And then it's really looking at the risk stack. So this is the output of our data sets. So we have the components we use through our automated modeling framework to develop the output, the risk stack on the different data sets, whether it's the flood maps, the risk scores, the terrain data sets, and ultimately the CAP modeling. And then we deliver that data, either clients hold that data on premise, or now we've evolved our API proposition. Clients can query the data on an as needs basis, and they can be very specific around the data sets they require. That can be specific or fluvial or sorry, river or coastal flooding or flash flooding. It could be under today's climate environment, but also under a range of different future climate scenarios that they can select through the API. So we have a lot of flexibility, particularly around the climate side. You can imagine that trying to model flooding at a global scale under different climate scenarios, emission scenarios, and also time horizons can be very computationally heavy. So
It's
we
mind-boggling.
have absolutely. So we thought, well, actually, we need to be very efficient here. So we developed a methodology through the API that allows us to very quickly produce flood maps for any recognized climate scenario up to between now and 2100 very efficiently. And so that reduces a lot of the compute and the data storage that we require. So again, a lot of clients are now starting to explore that flexibility on climate data through the API, which is benefiting both them and their end users.
Just a point of curiosity, is there some sort of massive data center sitting under the ground somewhere around Bristol?
Yeah, it's a big seller. So we have our own high performance computing stack here at Fathom, and we've always used our in-house compute capacity. We found it much more efficient. Obviously, we have to store a lot of the data in the cloud. But we have our own facility here that we're constantly evolving and updating, and that's really sort of the workhorse for our modeling and our data processing, and it's very heavily used, constantly used for as we evolve and develop our data sets.
I've heard that so-called supercomputers are often used for flood modeling. Would you call yours that?
Uh, I think the term supercomputer can be misconstrued sometimes. I would say we've got a very good high performance compute capacity here.
Yeah.
And we're looking at one of the things is around the sort of the application of the science. It's not just how we model it, but actually how can we be more efficient in our modeling using different types of compute techniques and technologies. And so we have a specific team looking at that. As you can imagine, trying to model flood risk and climate at a global scale is not straightforward, and it could be and it is very computationally expensive and intense. So we're always trying to look at how we can make those efficiencies and improve that, and also make use of new technologies and compute power that comes out. So yeah, it's constantly evolving.
Okay. Do you use GPUs?
Yeah, we are applying a GPU at the moment on part of our future modeling processing.
Yeah. All right, good. So good. We've covered some of the technical details, and I guess the nature of the services that you provide. Just linking this to another episode where I interviewed someone from Spatial Risk Systems in Manhattan. So they're kind of in a similar, or serving similar industry to you. So when I was preparing the newsletter or blog post for that episode, I came across a few dismaying annual reports from Markel, where they basically said that they were so poor at predicting natural catastrophe events or NatCat events that they shifted that line of insurance to a subsidiary. So in the context of Markel potentially being a client and helping them to make money again in that area, what could Fathom do? And is that really why Swiss Re purchased you?
Okay, well, obviously, I can't comment on the current situation at Markel, but we work with a lot of insurers to provide a much better understanding view of flood risk at a local and a global scale. And I think coming back to what we were talking about earlier about the transparency in the modeling and also helping our end users understand uncertainty. All models are different, they don't behave the same, and you're always going to get an output that it very often doesn't always reflect what happens in the real world. So it's really understanding the limitations of models and where they can be applied and appropriateness of that. And so we're working with all the major insurers to provide that understanding, and because of that transparency and the solid science background that we have, that was one of the reasons why Swiss Re were interested in engaging with Fathom. We started talking to them around the use of our data and flood models for their own purposes, and that kind of evolved as they got more into understanding more about the business and the science. Then that conversation expanded to where we are today.
I'm sort of one. I mean, I'm not an expert in insurance, but there's a lot of interesting things to explore here. But NatCat or natural catastrophes is a general term. Flooding is one of those types of events. Do you know what proportion of NatCat events are flood related? And, therefore, does Fathom have explanatory power here in trying to help insurance companies generally begin to make money where they have consistently lost money recently?
Yeah. Well, if flooding is one of the largest perils or the most impactful perils at a global scale, both for the insurance sector, but also as a NatCat impact. And so because of its ubiquitous nature, then it is one of the key perils that insurers really need to understand. And the science around flood modelling is relatively juvenile. It's only really in the last sort of 5-10 years that there's been a much better understanding of the impact or how water behaves across the Earth's surface, and deriving better models from that. And so, traditionally, insurers who have always used flood models and CAT models, have had to base their decisions on the science at the time, and some of those legacy decisions prove that out. So as the science and the data is evolving, that's only going to improve, and insurers will get a much better understanding, or are getting a much better understanding of flood risk, both today and under future climate scenarios, in key areas like UK, Europe, and America, but also in emerging markets or evolving markets like Southeast Asia and South America as well.
The next question is, was there a fight over who would buy Fathom, if you're able to disclose anything there?
As a sort of successful scale-up business with a good client base and growing client base, we're always going to have people that are interested in us, and we're always having various conversations. people wanted to understand a bit more about who we were and where we were going. And so really when we started engaging with Swiss Re, we felt that that was a very good fit for the business, and on a number of levels, both sort of academically in the respect that they have for academic rigor and research, but also commercially as well. And so, very quickly, we came to that conclusion and wanted to see it out and engage with Swiss Re and join as part of the organisation.
Yep. Okay. Do you know of any other private companies that were doing or are doing similar things to Fathom? How much interest is there in this type of modeling?
Yeah, there are a number of small boutique organisations. We work with a company called RIASC on wind modelling, tropical cyclone modelling. They started in the insurance sector and they're broadening their appeal. So we do identify sort of best in class organisations to engage with, there's not many of them, and it's interesting, understanding them and their motivations around this. So there's a lot of organisations that talk about climate and climate resilience and have pulled data together, and I think it's really, we question some of the validity of that data set. Those data sets, we have robust science. We're very open. It's ensuring that when clients are looking at other data sets, they ask those sensible questions around the methodologies, the validation of the data, and things like that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So I guess you mentioned this boutique firm that was focusing on wind. Is that because the direction of the wind needs to stay, the strength of it helps explain propagation of water across the surface? Is that why you're partnering with them?
So when you look at tropical cyclones or in the US hurricanes, you've got a combined effect of the extreme rainfall precipitation in those areas, but also the storm surge. So where the wind is actually driving the sea up to extremely high levels and forcing that inland over the coastal defences and up estuaries. So you're getting a compounding event where you've got extreme rainfall, but also the sea coming in as well. So that level of modelling hasn't really been done before. So that's what we're looking at currently is the impact of hurricanes, the combined impact of the storm surge and the extreme rainfall for flash flooding, ultimately river flooding and coastal flooding.
So that really highlights how it's sort of a whole of environmental system modelling exercise to, in the end, understand where the water's going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not understanding where the water is coming from or where it's going to go. It's not straightforward. There's so many variables, and we've obviously spent a long time trying to hone those methods in that. But there's always more we can do, and where we have additional data, more detailed data of things like flood defences or river gauges, or ultimately more detailed climate models, higher resolution climate models that are coming out. It's actually pulling those data sets in to understand that ecosystem and understanding how that's going to benefit end users in a much more detailed understanding of flood risk under current and climate scenarios.
Yeah, it's fascinating how this is as much, yes, about flood modeling as efforts to really predict the state of the environment. It's incredible. I feel like and definitely there would be whole podcasts devoted just to this. This is a problem on this podcast. I talk with so many different people doing so many different things, and I realize how I literally know nothing, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, well, I think the whole climate change piece is obviously expanding as we get to understand it. So yeah, climate change is going to grow as we get high resolution climate models. Because at the moment, they're very coarse. We have to make what we need for flood models is understanding rainfall, and so you don't get those in climate models because they're too coarse. But we're evolving those models. We're doing some work with the Met Office around hyper resolution models, and so how can we draw out the data we actually need for our modeling as these our better understanding of global climate models evolves.
Yep. Just I've got a couple more questions, but just satisfy my curiosity and hopefully that of listeners. And I am putting you on the spot a bit here, but is there some sort of a hierarchy of impact of NatCat events? And I get the impression that flooding sits towards the top of that, but I'm just wondering which other types of NatCat events that you might know about that are especially expensive.
Yeah, well, flooding is ubiquitous and it's very localized. You can have small variations in terrain and other areas, and so that's why we have to have very detailed models. When you're looking at things like windstorm or earthquake, those are very heavily modeled. There is good understanding around that, but they cover large areas, and it's easier to a certain extent to model those impacts. But of course, as we get a better understanding around climate change, things like drought and heat stress are evolving, and there's a lot of talk about how those models are being developed as we go forward, because that heat stress can in fact impact a whole range of things from food production to communities to infrastructure, and so it's getting that balance, and a lot of areas are compounded by multiple cat types of natural catastrophe elements or perils, and so it's trying to get that understanding. But invariably, flooding is pretty ubiquitous globally, and most people are impacted by it. So you think particularly dry areas. Look what happened in Dubai recently. With the floods there, and so it's really getting a much better understanding of the impacts of those very extreme rainfall events, and how they can impact local communities.
Yeah. Okay. All right then. So just making sure that we keep our finger on the pulse. What, if anything, are your customers saying to you about their AI needs?
Yeah, so we've used machine learning for some years now in the application of our data sets, and developing data sets. And I think we've got to be very mindful that there's a lot of hype around AI. And coming back to our sort of scientific roots, we really see AI as a tool, another tool we can apply to developing our data sets. And so whether that's basically pulling in better data sets or taking data sets that are our building blocks like terrain data or river gauge data, and actually using AI to produce better input data sets, but also in the modeling on how we produce better data sets on the output side. We've talked to a number of organizations around their particular application of AI in their processes, and we're learning from that all the time. I think because of the nature of flood modeling, it's going to be very difficult to get a seamless view of flood risk, particularly under climate scenarios, through AI today. However, it is evolving, and I think we have a number of organizations that are looking at applying AI for maybe using terrain data in our data sets. We've got to be mindful that we're not giving out our crown jewels that people can train their machines on and ultimately undermine our business model. So, for us, that's motivation to make sure we're staying ahead of the game and applying AI appropriately, and bringing those values and those benefits to ultimately to our end customers as well.
Fascinating. Again, I have so many questions. I mean, like what I'm tempted to do after this is, well, I guess I don't have access to your system actually, but maybe a customer might be tempted to open ChatGPT and ask it to predict, flooding for their area of interest, and then compare it to what the output of your system is. I wonder how those comparisons go.
Yeah, I think it'd be really interesting. We do a lot of validation of our data and compare our data to known data sets here in the UK. And so we've got some pretty good metrics around that and good understanding we share with our customers on that. And I think it's, a lot of it is around, there is flood risk. What are you basing it on? Comparing like for like. Very often we find that our data sets can be compared to different methodologies. So how people actually take the data and process and apply the data can be quite different. All our data is 1 and 2D modeling. So that's really important. A lot of areas just do 1D modeling. And so
what does that mean exactly? Sorry, what does
one-dimensional modeling. So we do 1D and 2D. So that means we actually, in our models, we take into consideration the channels, the flow of water in river channels. So we take a river network and we put the river channels into our model. A lot of flood models don't take into consideration the conveyance of water in the river channels, which means that they just look at the water across the floodplain, effectively the physics, the way the water moves across a floodplain without that channel, and it's really quite different. So you do get different outputs depending on the type of modeling. We've published a number of papers around the sort of specific the channel modeling, have proved that actually you do get better data, better outputs through the use of river channels in flood models. And of course, why wouldn't you put a river channel in the model? Because the water is going to start off flowing in the river before it reaches, overtops the banks and floods out onto the floodplain. So you need to understand where that water is and how it behaves, and so that's why we need to put river channels in our models.
That's a really nice illustration. Like you used the term before, how it's the state of the science or application of it is a bit juvenile, and that's a really nice illustration. If competitors are trying to get away with not modeling that, to me as an outsider, it shows how recent developments are.
Yeah, a lot of people talk about flood modeling, but it's what we can be termed as a bathtub model. You just fill up that area of water and you get the wetted perimeter, and that very often doesn't represent the way the water actually flows in the real world. So that's why it's important to have these elements like river channels, but also things like flood defenses, because you need to know where the water flows, where the areas that are protected from that water flow, and particularly when it gets into levels of flooding. So those elements are really important in trying to evolve and develop a better understanding of the flooding that we're trying to output.
Yeah, I can't help myself. I've got the Thames up here in my background.
Yeah,
there's a well-known project, Team 2100, which is about the flood defences for the next 100 years, really, for the Thames. So how would Fathom stack up with a prediction of flooding under certain scenarios on the Thames?
Yeah, so obviously the Thames is a really specialist environment because you've got the barrier and the huge investment in flood protection, and we build all that into our models, and we give a views of a defended and an undefended view. So we can by providing that to our end users, they can get a really good understanding to say, okay, what level of defence have Fathom actually built in, and actually what does it look without those defences? So we help get a much provide those two views of effectively the impact of defences, but also in the data we provide a metadata layer that has a confidence score in there that makes certain assumptions around the level or the detail or the veracity of the defence data, will help provide a higher confidence score in the data. So again, it's helping end users get a much better understanding around uncertainty in the models.
And that immediately feeds on to return on investment cases that consultancies might make to local planning authorities to invest to build flood protection infrastructure. So I guess I can see then how you would have engineering consultancies as clients to use your data to help justify having local governments pay for their services to build and maintain these sorts of things.
That's right, and it's not just a static snapshot. I talked about our flood maps, some of the other projects we've done where we've actually done live projects, taking our automated modelling framework that we use to create the maps. We've applied that in a number of different ways, and one great example was with Arup for the World Bank in Dar es Salaam. The World Bank came to Arup and said, we need to, the population of Dar es Salaam is going to expand by 50% over the next 20 to 30 years. It's going to be uncontrolled building and urbanisation. How can we understand the impacts of both climate change and urbanisation in relation to flooding, and then mitigate some of those impacts? So we worked with Arup, we provided them our data sets are off-the-shelf data sets looking at climate risk and the increase in the changes in flooding due to certain climate scenarios. They then provide us data on the population change and the urbanization change between now and I think it's 2030 and 2040 across the city. We reran the model and then we're able to say, okay, here's the impact of the combined events for climate change and also urbanization on flooding. They then took that data set and the outputs and then looked at a number of nature-based solutions interventions across the city at a broad scale. We then again took that, reran the model, and we were able to identify about 15,000 properties that were actually a reduced impact to flooding due to the combination of urbanisation and climate change. So it was a broad scale view to look at the what if and the options, and that's really where our data works in that overview. Of course, the next stage is looking at those specific and nature-based solutions interventions and modelling those in more detail, and that's really the next stage that we would pass on. But it's that broad scale what if scenario. We've just done a big project in modelling the whole of Florida, where we're taking into consideration the extreme rainfall events they get through hurricanes. And we've developed a totally bespoke data set for the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. And they've actually gone through a very detailed vulnerability assessment of tens or hundreds of thousands or millions of their critical assets across the state to look at vulnerability now, but also under future climate scenarios. And we recently modeled, in the process of working with the Texas Water Development Board, modeling the whole of Texas under current and future climate scenarios. And we've been working with the state climatologists in Texas to really evolve that understanding. And so that's the second phase of the project for the whole state to go. They're currently going through a regional flood planning exercise where they're providing this data out to the local stakeholders, and they can determine, how they want to protect themselves from the impact of flooding. This project started off where the Texas legislative and stated we needed to future-proof the state after Hurricane Harvey proved that there were huge issues and damaged the economy, and lots of people suffered as a consequence of that hurricane. So they were looking at future-proofing that, and they needed to get a benchmark to say, okay, what are the issues? How do we understand the impact of flooding across the state? And when they started looking at it, they realized that there was a significant number of counties, something like 60% of the counties across the state had no real detailed flood mapping. And the flood mapping they had was from different methodologies, different outputs, and it wasn't consistent.
All sorts of confounding variables there.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's where we came in. We provided a continuous flood map across the state that was consistent, so that they could start basing these decisions on. They were looking at it, if they'd done it through their traditional methods, it would have taken many, many years and tens of millions of dollars. We were able to turn it around in a matter of months and for a fraction of that. So, by applying our modeling framework, we can now start doing these sort of what if scenarios and bespoke modeling, bringing in the science that we have, but actually applying it specifically for some of our clients. And that's, I think, an area that is going to be really interesting as we move forward, as people starting to understand the impact of climate change, but also the resilience. How do they adapt themselves to become more resilient to those impacts? And I think that we have a good position to play in that dialogue.
Wow, that's so inspiring, Gavin.
Thank you.
I'm amazed. So something that came up for me because I was talking about the helping to make the case for return on investment. I don't know how much the Thames flood barriers cost, but I presume it would be several orders of magnitude more costly just letting the surrounding city be flooded. So does your system give information on the financial cost of a flood over a certain area?
Yeah, that can be. So our data is, we show you the areas that get inundated or effectively get wet by a flood event through our. So that's just the maps. Through our catastrophe modeling, or the CAT modeling, we take into consideration things like property values, vulnerability. So understanding the structure, the occupation of those types of buildings. Is it a factory? Is it a hospital?
So lost
is it
revenue as
a data
well.
center? So you can start then calculating the impact of flooding as losses. Now that's could be physical losses and the building infrastructure, but also you've got to consider things like business interruption. So if a data center or a hospital or something is knocked out of action, what's going to be the knock-on impact to that organization?
So there's economic modeling too.
Yeah, and I think we go some way towards that. Some of our partners really have taken some of our data. That we work with a company called One Concern that use our data to start evolving and developing the values of things like business interruption to municipalities and large corporates. So when you're talking about an impact of flooding, and you cited London, it's not just the damage to the buildings, it's obviously the impact to the communities and also the long-term impact on things like the economy, but also, and this is something that we're starting to get more involved in, is the health impact of flooding on individuals and communities. It's not just the physical health, but also the mental health. And
uprooted lives, there's no bigger psychological impact than how to rebuild a
it has many connotations, and we've been doing some work with the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation for evolving countries, where you're looking at flooding and then malaria risk, and how the malarial impacts can be derived from flooding, and actually predicting that and being more proactive in the understanding of malaria and the impact of malaria due to flooding.
Okay, so last bite at the cherry here before we go on to the last question. When you were giving that amazing survey of all the different US states and territories, and even in Tanzania, where you were having an impact, I couldn't help but think it would be amazing to have some sort of city design dashboard where you propose a flood barrier and your system responds with an adjustment to the area that's flooded, and you almost see a financial value in the top right that's updated.
Yeah.
Do you have those sorts of interactive planning tools, or is there any discussions to integrate with them? Or
so yeah, and there's a number of tools or city planning tools that are out there. I suspect they're probably not as subtle or detailed as you're alluding to. We're looking at cause and effect, but ultimately where we're going to, and the Dar es Salaam example is a good one, where we're looking at cause and effect, and we can model that impact analysis at a broad scale. When you start getting down into individual stretches of river, and you're thinking about the Thames and the Thames barrier, that's much more detailed, and so we've got to understand where our models can provide value, and then where a more detailed model picks that up and takes that forward. So it's that combination really, and that handoff between the two types of modeling.
Yep. Okay. Oh, I could keep this going for hours, but I'll get to the last question. All right. So if you were to hire an apprentice, what qualities would get them the job?
Yeah, okay. I think someone that really is interested in what we're doing. So we've had a number of interns in during the summer from the Bristol Uni. One thing that's really struck me is sort of their intellectual curiosity, and they're willing to understand, to say, okay, well, actually, what are we producing here? What is that impact going to make? Some of them wants to make a difference, particularly if we can provide better data for people to understand the impact of flooding and climate change, is really important. And I think those types of individuals that have that curiosity, that want to help contribute to us, and we're looking we will be looking really for people that want to contribute, that have ideas, that want to get engaged and help drive us forward in our thinking and our involvement. And I think that's really important. And of course, bringing those types of people into the organisation as apprentices, they have a different perspective. They have a much younger perspective, different views on things. So we need to respect that and bring those into what we evolve during through our working practices and the models we deliver. So I think that's really important. And having obviously a technical level of competence, but I think it's that innate curiosity to say, okay, well, how can we do things better? I see issues around flooding and climate change impacting communities. What can I do to help improve that situation.
Yeah, this is a wonderful message, Gavin, and a great note to end on. I'm aware that I've had an idiotic grin on my face this whole episode because it's really exciting. It's so amazing. I am truly privileged to have been able to have this chat with you, Gavin, and really looking forward to publishing this for all of our listeners.
Yeah, sure. So if there's any other questions you want to follow up with, we have obviously the Fathom website where we have all our detail on our data sets, but also importantly, all our research, all our scientific papers we make available there. We have some really good videos that we've put together around the science and the application. It's not me talking, it's our modelers, it's the climatologists, it's the flood modelers who actually develop the models are presenting the work that they've done. So I think, for people that want to understand more about our data, that's a great place to go. And we have a lot of information around the validation of our data sets. How do we compare to known data sets like from the Environment Agency or from FEMA in the US? I would encourage people to follow us through our social media, LinkedIn and others. We're always posting some really interesting information on there, the research and the impact of our data set. So I would encourage people to follow us there. But and of course, listening to this podcast will certainly help. And it's been great to speak to you, Wilfred. I think you asked some very interesting questions.
Appreciate it, Gavin. It's been great.